Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Today we will be talking about climate change and the Islamic perspective on it. Now, before we get to the Islamic side of things, we need to understand a little bit and have some background about what is climate change and how does it work and why does it matter. Right? Most scientists, in fact, the overwhelming majority of scientists, estimate that at the current rate of climate change, organized human life may not be possible beyond the end of the century. Right? Even now, we see the effects of climate change with increasing temperatures every year, record-breaking temperatures every year, etc. This is considered the greatest existential threat, with the possible exception of a nuclear catastrophe. Right? Recently, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said we are on the highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. So let's try to understand what is all this discussion about climate change, what's happening here, and why it matters before we get to like what Islam can tell us about this. Right. So what causes climate change? The scientific understanding of climate change, the scientific principle underlying climate change is very straightforward. Right. There's a really good book about this. I'll give you the references later on by Lawrence Krauss, and all of it can be summarized in one single sentence, which is this: warm air holds more moisture than cold air. This is all you need to know in order to understand climate change. Once you understand this, everything else, all the consequences of climate change, can be deduced from this one single statement. So, for instance, when if warm air holds more moisture than cold air, it causes the drying of the land, and that results in droughts and famines and crop failures, right? That we have been seeing all over the world at present. On the other hand, it also results in, on the other hand, because the air is holding more moisture, you get heavier, you get more rainfalls, you get bigger floods, we get bigger landslides, as depicted in this picture from Wayanad last year, right? So the exact same phenomenon can explain both extremes of environmental variations. Right, in India alone, more than 1.5 million people die of climate change related issues like heat strokes, floods, droughts, famines, etc. every single year. This could be headline news every single day, right? For years together. That's how big this issue is, and I'll come to the problem of media coverage of climate change a little bit later. Now, so another consequence of the warm air is that warm air also results in the melting of glaciers and rising sea levels. It is estimated that sea levels can rise up to 5 meters, submerging many parts of low-lying countries, like which include Bangladesh, which includes USA, it includes parts of India, parts of Australia, and many other countries. Right? This also means that melting glaciers also means that there is a result in it results in melting glaciers also result in the loss of habitat for species that depend on this kind of an ice on this ice for their survival. It's expected that 50% of all species are expected to perish due to the inability to adapt to the changing environment and the speed with which the environment is changing around us. So what's happening? What's causing the warming of the air? Mostly, the biggest source of warming of the air and the whole process of greenhouse gas, emissions are depicted in the image here. It's a picture from NASA. Most of the carbon emissions come from fossil fuels, including coal, oil, natural gas, etc., which trap heat into in the Earth's atmosphere, and that's what's resulting in the warming of the atmosphere. The second factor is the things that help prevent this kind of warming are trees and forests, right? And deforestation is another contributor to this, where lack of trees to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere worsens the problem of the already entrapped carbon emissions in the air. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have dumped over 500 billion metric tons of carbon in the atmosphere. Right, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air today, which is somewhere around 400 parts per million, is higher than it has ever been at any point in the last 800,000 years. Climate change is so significant because it affects everyone. However, it currently affects those people who are least responsible for it the most. Here's an example. Melting glaciers and floods in Pakistan in 2022 submerged one third of the country, affected 33 million people, and resulted in $15 billion worth of damages. Some people have actually estimated that this is probably the costliest disaster in human history, right? But if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, countries like Pakistan and India have contributed very, very little to greenhouse gas emissions. So the people who are least responsible for it, unfortunately, are the ones who are being affected the most at present. But eventually it'll get to everyone. That's the nature of climate change. Despite all of this, almost no political parties talk about it in the agenda. No one is actually campaigning for climate change, and with very few exceptions, of course, but there is way too little by way of that. Corporates do the exact opposite. They lobby against setting limits on carbon emissions rather than trying to do something to reduce rates of carbon emissions. Right, and mainstream media, which is mostly owned by corporates in the first place, routinely underreports the magnitude of the crisis because they want to protect corporate interests. And very few countries take serious steps to limit climate change. Take the country I'm in, like Canada. Here's the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, campaigning to save the planet. And here's the same Prime Minister talking about how no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there. Right? So there is a lot of lip service going on. There's a lot of talk about doing something for the environment, but really not enough is being done, and not enough people care for it. Certainly not the corporates, certainly not most of the governments in the world. So now let's talk about the Islamic perspective on all of this. How does Islam come into this, and how does it help us understand what's happening here? Everything you want to know about climate and climate change can be summarized in one single ayah of the Quran. It's a very powerful ayah. It took me a really long time to understand what it actually meant. Uh, the ayah is this, I think Surah Rum, chapter 30, verse 41. And the ayah says this: corruption has appeared in the land and sea by what the hands of people have earned. So he may let them taste of what they have done. So perhaps they will return to righteousness. When I used to read this, I always used to wonder, what does corruption in the sea mean? Like corruption in the land makes sense, but what does corruption of the sea actually mean? Right? And turns out what we have been doing on the land does have consequences for the sea as well. Ocean temperatures have been at record highs because of the consequences of all the activity of human activity on the land. This has resulted, and oceans are one of the biggest barrier buffers protections we have against climate change, right? Because ocean absorbs one third of all the carbon dioxide circulates in the atmosphere, right? And because the ocean is absorbing all of this carbon dioxide, it's actually resulting in increased acidity of the oceans. This is the same principle that we use in carbonated drinks, right? So if you want, you can think of this as a kind of a pepsification of the oceans, but a lot less fun because of the massive loss of coral reefs and sea life, and also warming temperatures mean that that the oceans can support more species in the oceans die because warm water can hold less oxygen than cold water does. So, how does Islam relate to the factors contributing to climate change? The single biggest individual factor in climate change is consumerism and wastage. The reason corporates are so keen on exploiting the earth and mining for minerals and getting as much fossil fuels out of it is because they are responding to the huge consumer demands for fossil fuels and for petrochemical products. That includes everything from our clothes to equipments we see, things made of plastic, rubber, tires, cars, everything. Right? They're mostly responding to the demands of consumers. And Islam inherently discourages consumerism and wastage. There's a very famous hadith where the Prophet ﷺ sees Sahaba making wudu, and he says, "What is this extravagance?" And the Sahaba asks, "Is there extravagance with water when making wudu?" And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Yes. Do not waste water, even if you are on the banks of a flowing river." There are verses in the Quran also which describe the same idea. So here's a verse which says, "Children of Adam, eat and drink, but do not waste. Surely He does not like the wasteful." What makes Islam different from current climate activism is that in Islam, it is an inherent part of how we are. Right? It's not a reaction to the present crisis. It does not matter how much water you have. You still tend to you still have to be conservative, and you should try not to waste and not to consume more than you actually need. That's the Islamic perspective on consumption. One thing that has made consumption worse is so let's take I'm sorry jumping ahead there, right? So let's take the case of just one country, like the richest country in the world, the United States, right? The country that invented modern advertising and consumerism, and also happens to be the biggest victim of consumerism themselves, right? The US is considered the most consumerist country in the world. I'll just give you there are lots of statistics for this. I'll just give you one simple example, right? US has 3.1% of the world's children, but buys 40% of all the toys in the world, right? And before we laugh at them, we should remember that all the other countries like India, many other countries are following suit and going towards the exact same consumerist kind of mentality that the US had basically invented and promoted during the industrial era, since the industrial era. Um, so let's look at the case of the US. Uh, one of the things that's worsening the problem of consumption in the US is the fact that corporates have started for a very long time introducing very low quality products that don't last for too long. Now, you may think it's because we don't have the technology. Actually, we do. We do have the technology to make things very reliable and very robust and last for a very long time. It is that they deliberately choose not to do it, and there's an interesting history behind this, right? In 1925, bulb manufacturers were thinking of ways to increase their own profits. And what they decided was to reduce the life of bulbs in order to increase repeat sales and increase profits so that they'll make more money. The exact same philosophy was adopted by other industries. And that's how we get fast fashion. That's how we get electronics. That's how we get furnitures. You buy some toys for kids, it breaks down by the end of the weekend. Right? It is not that we don't have the technology to build a toy that lasts more than a week. I mean, we can put a person on the moon. We can make toys that's going to last longer than that. But it's a deliberate choice. It's done with the intention of those toys so, breaking down, so that people go back and buy more toys for the kids after they throw another tantrum. Uh, no, or just this principle of deceiving people by reducing the quality of your goods by itself is a separate talk on, and you can talk about all the ways in which it violates the ethical practices in Islam. But I want to focus here on a slightly different aspect of this. I want to focus on the question of where does the money for all this consumption actually come from? Right. If you look at US wages and median incomes over the past 40 years, you'll see that this has been practically a flat line. Right. In real terms, US wages have not changed at all since the 1960s. Right. The current generation of Americans are less likely to own a house, to be able to save enough to afford retirement, to afford insurance. 10% of people in the US don't have any insurance. 25% of them don't have adequate insurance coverage. So one-fourth of the population does not have as much insurance as they would actually need, right? And then less likely to live as long as even their parents' generation. So it's a really bad situation in which most Americans find themselves. But still, consumerism is an all-time high. How does this work? How do we resolve that kind of a paradox? This is where the genius of the interest-based system comes in. Right in the 1970s, somewhere around there, banks began to introduce the concept of interest-based credit cards as an alternative to cash, and now it is so ubiquitous that you can't get around it. Like I have tried living, like for the first 5 years I was in the US, tried living without a credit card. It's incredibly difficult to do that, right? Because everything is based on your availability of credit and your credit worthiness and things like that. It's tied into things in such a deep way that we simply can't escape having credit cards, right? So what banks decided was let's have an interest-based credit card system, which is an alternative to cash. So now even if you don't have money to buy something, you can borrow from your future self, so to speak, to pay for goods and services. And there's a nice documentary about consumerism on Netflix. I highly recommend watching this. Right now, what all of this artificial ability to generate money or borrow from your future self results in is further increase in consumer demand, and of course, consequently, more wastage at the end of at the end of the life cycle of the product. Now, what happens? This also has another consequence, of course, apart from the climate. What happens if your future self is broke and ends up defaulting? In that case, you incur huge interest. The average interest on credit cards in North America is somewhere around 24.2%. All right, and so a person very quickly spirals into great amount of debt, often into bankruptcy and so on. And this worsens the problem of the huge wealth disparity you see in the richest country in the world. So no one, not even the richest country in the world, is immune to the negative consequences of the interest-based system, which is worsening the problem of poverty, but also contributing significantly to the end of organized human life as we know it. To summarize, interest-based system is one of the main culprits in climate change from our perspective because it results in increased consumption and consequently increased wastage. It also prevents subsistence-based enterprises. If you go to every time you go to I go to India, you see these small department stores that's run by usually just a family, right? These stores run for decades together, and they take care of all the needs of the family, the children's education, marriage, retirement, all of it, right? And they go on for generations together. Right, that this is subsistence-based enterprises. We can do this forever for subsistence-based farming, for subsistence-based agriculture. Small stores that run subsistence. All of these we can do for a very, very long time. Right, they don't have huge environmental impacts. Right, but you simply, if you are a large corporation, manufacturer, like a manufacturer in an interest-based system, this is not an option at all. You have huge loans, and they're accruing interest all the time. So you need to keep running to stay in the same place. You need to make more and more profits, right, in order to be able to offset the huge interest-based loans that you have already taken. Which is why every time a CEO underperforms and does not make more profit in this quarter than they did in the previous quarter, they get kicked out, and then you get a new CEO who's able to come up with newer and more ingenious ways, like the ones we saw earlier about reducing the quality of products, etc., to try and further improve the amount of profits that the corporation is making. Right. So what we get is because of the interest-based system, right? Everyone's affected by this, right? So you get corporates doing over drilling, over mining, or farming, or fishing, massive amounts of deforestation, etc. Right? And none of this would be true if we just had subsistence based if a person goes to the jungle, like tribal people who live in tribal areas have done this for millennia now. They go to the jungle, they take whatever they need, and they come back, right? And fishermen in Kerala and places like that have lived for centuries by just going to the sea, catching what of the fish they need, and coming back. Subsistence is something that's sustainable. There's enough and plenty in the oceans to help people who are trying to make a subsistence based living. What the ocean is not prepared for is large scale, massive super tankers, right? And large shipping corporations basically emptying the oceans all at once. Islam inspires us to find solutions to these problems, right? And the most immediate one, as far as climate change is concerned, from our perspective, is probably to come up with economic solutions. Now, the bad news here is that we don't have good solutions here. We may have a few here or there, and we can discuss that later on, right? But we don't have many interest-free and sustainable alternatives. The bigger problem is that we don't have problems that will work within the current economic framework. Almost all solutions we can think of involves like microfinance and so that involves stepping out of the mainstream economic framework, and we simply don't have that. There's a good book on this by Haris Irfan called Heaven's Bankers. Um, I've been following Haris Irfan for some time, and more recently, he's been a lot more interested in whether the problem may be the economic framework in which we have to work. And these days, he's a lot more interested in whether um, decentralized finance and cryptocurrencies could be the answer. Could this be the way forward for Islamic finance? Now, this is a topic that deserves its own discussion, and if anyone's interested in working on something like this together, I'm happy to be involved. Right. So we don't have economic solutions, but that's something that we can work towards given our understanding of what the problems are, right? There may be scientific solutions that we can work towards. If you're a student, you're a researcher, you're an engineer, right? These are the kinds of things that you could really be thinking about. There can be some scientific solutions that may actually be feasible, especially solar energy, right? Every single day, more than 1,000 times, the total energy used by all of humanity rains down from the sun. The question is, how can we harness at least a fraction of that energy? And if we are able to do that, even 1,000th of that, then we should be able to solve all energy needs using like clean energy. So that's one thing that we could really be working towards. But still, solar energy is in its infancy. It has lots of problems, right? It requires a lot of space. It does not provide uninterrupted supply of energy and so on. So there are issues that need to be resolved, but it's something that definitely a promising technology in the future. There may be other solutions, especially nuclear fusion research, maybe something that can actually be a game changer as far as energy consumption is concerned. In his last book, Stephen Hawking actually was answering questions by an interviewer, and he actually said this. He said nuclear energy would be, if it becomes a practical power source, then it would provide us with an inexhaustible supply of clean energy, and not cause any pollutions and not cause any global warmings, not causing any global warming. So there are solutions, and there are solutions on the horizon, but they're still in the infancy, and there is a lot of need for research and education, and people working towards these things, whether from a business perspective or from a research perspective and education perspective, and so on. One of the things these scientific solutions do also is that it helps create new jobs for workers displaced from the more traditional fossil fuel industries like coal mining and oil and gas industry, etc. After all, the people who are working in these industries are not responsible for what's happening. They're just trying to earn a living, right? So there is a need to also make sure that they have something they can move on to. Without creating massive problems of unemployment. Um, Now, what if you're not a scientist? You're not a researcher. You're not a student trying to think about trying to choose a career path. What could you do? Even the simplest things can help here, right? Things like reducing our use of single-use plastics, right? That by itself could be a big contribution. One of the genius of the corporate system has been shifting the responsibility of recycling onto consumers. Those of you who are old enough might remember that when we were young, like all the carbonated drinks like Pepsi and Coke, and these used to come in these big trucks. Where and they would supply all these bottles, glass bottles, to stores, and then come and collect them, and then go clean them again, and then use them again, right? Somewhere in the 1980s, some person sitting in Coke or Pepsi, I don't know where, came up with the idea that we could save a lot of money on logistics, right? We could save a lot of money on logistics if we just shift to plastic cans and tin cans rather than waste all this money distributing and then taking back glass bottles, right? And since then, it has been that has been the case, and this has significantly increased the amount of pollution. Whenever corporates are asked about this, they just keep talking about recycling, but then even they know fully well that less than 10% of things that are labeled as recyclable actually gets recycled. 90% of that just ends up, in landfill, becomes waste, gathers in the oceans, and so on. Um, so what we can do could be something as simple as voting for political representatives who are willing to shift the responsibility of minimizing waste back to corporates, and voting for political representatives who are actually aware and have some understanding of what's happening in climate change, how these different factors are affecting it, and what can be done about it more generally. Here's another thing you could do. It does not require any scientific training or education. We can plant more trees. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever plants a tree or sows seeds, and then a bird or a person or an animal eats from it, that is charity for him. There is still hope. Things are not everything is lost. Although we are on the highway to climate hell, as the UN Secretary General said, there are still things we can do, and there is something. There are still things that can change, right? Which makes this time too early for us to actually give up on things. In fact, it makes it the time for us to work even harder because we know that crisis can be averted if we actually take action now. Here's a picture of Chernobyl nuclear power plant. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history. Definitely look it up. Right? This entire city of Chernobyl is uninhabitable for the next 20,000 years. And you see how nature has basically taken back that this concrete jungle and turned it into a proper jungle. There is significant resilience in nature, right? And For example, increased carbon in the atmosphere results in trees growing a little bit faster than they used to. Right, so nature does work with us whenever we try to. It meets us halfway when you're trying to make changes to the climate, right? There's also there's no technical term for this, but I like to think of this as a tropicalization of higher latitudes as global temperatures and humidity increases. So trees and agriculture that was only possible in tropical regions now those trees and plants survive in higher latitudes, and agriculture and farming becomes not possible in those regions as well. So there is a lot that nature does to try and be resilient and to try and help out when we are trying to make things better for the planet. It's almost as if the earth was designed keeping people and human behavior in mind. Uh, One thing we see about climate change is that it's not the big corporates, it's not the big politicians, the super rich who are doing the most for climate change. It's actually all over the world. It's the most marginalized people who are at the forefront of climate change and actually trying to save the planet, right? When everyone else is, as Noam Chomsky said, racing to the precipice. The First Nations in Canada, for example, are the ones who are mostly working towards avoiding, increasing number of oil pipelines here, right? The Adivasis and tribals in India are the people who are at the forefront of reducing deforestation and mining in Indian jungles, right? And farmers in India are the ones who are at the forefront of privatizing agriculture, and they're the ones who want to keep it as a subsistence kind of a system, which is where they have kept it for thousands of years, and it can continue that way for another other thousands of years, right? We as Muslims could be a larger part of this really broad campaign to try and save the climate and do something about reducing the effects of climate change. Because after all, we Muslims are the kind of the outsiders of the modern world. Right? We hold on to our faith and we hold on to our values despite our education, despite which society we find ourselves in. We believe in minimizing consumption. We have a unique perspective on the role of the interest-based system and how it is, it is a bane of all climate change initiatives, right? And we believe that conserving the environment is part of our faith. Just look at the number of surahs in the Quran that's named after natural phenomena, like surah about bees, surah about ants, surah about spiders, surah about figs and elephants, and we learn this right from beginning to have a very close relationship with our environment and with nature. We are the people who grew up listening to stories of how Hazrat Suleiman stopped a massive army in order to save a colony of ants. Right? So we could be the outsiders when it comes to caring for the environment. Let's do what other people have not enough people have been doing around us, right? Whether it is through our individual or collective action, whether it is through the kind of political choices and the kind of politicians, right? It's within terms of the political choices we make, And in terms of political and social activism, also, of course, when you have the opportunity, by contributing to this in terms of our scientific, technological, and educational pursuits. The Prophet ﷺ once said, Islam began as something strange, and it will return to being strange. So blessed are the strangers. We should feel comfortable being the kind of outsiders in the world in which we find ourselves, as long as we are doing the right things, right? Only good things will happen, inshallah. So, thank you all very much for listening. Here are some of the books I highly recommend reading on this topic. Each of them discusses a different aspect of climate change, right? Thank you all for listening, and let me know if you have any questions. Assalamu alaikum.